So, as you can see here, I am covering heads-up play, specifically tournament heads-up play. That's a big topic, and there's a lot to talk about there. It's timely because I was working on a course over the last year. I'll give a little information on that later. And the course was kind of a small scope, working on the heads-up knowledge that a tournament player would need for those moments where they make it to heads-up. And it turned into kind of a broader thing where I wanted to cover formats that include heads-up sit and go, at least to some extent. So no anti-format, formats that include live tournaments, so big blind anti-format. But what I'm going through today, which is also the basis for the work that I did over the last year, is it's geared to the online tournament structure. And I think I do mention that later, but the idea here is you're an online tournament player, you've made it to heads-up, what do I do now? How do I win in this environment? And of course, even within that, there's a ton to talk about, so I'll describe shortly how I narrowed that down. But I want to start with a little, quiz, piece of trivia, let's say. This is just something I like to think about as the opportunity that you're presented when you play heads up in a tournament. You're playing against someone who does not play heads up full time, who doesn't have a lot of experience playing heads up matches, and probably hasn't given a whole lot of thought to how they're going to play heads up. And you might be the same way. So both of you are like this, right? But hopefully by the end of this seminar, you'll be more prepared than everyone else. But it's good to know, what mistakes do you think that you or your opponents are most likely to make when they play heads up? So, I'm imagining most or all of you are non-experts in the format. What do you think you're likely to do? Are you more likely to overbluff? Are you likely to overfold? Are you likely to miss value in some way? Or just all of the above? The answer is all of them, it's very easy. And I think this might even be on the next slide. Yes, it is. So I want to bring this up. This is kind of like whenever I coach someone at heads up the first time, this feels like the preamble that they need to receive, which is you're playing really, really wide ranges. That's the nature of the game that we cannot change. That isn't opponent dependent. You're just playing really, really wide ranges in heads up. So what happens when your range is really wide and you're not used to that? Well, you bluff too often because you routinely get dealt hands that look like they should bluff, right? So this is natural. This is subconscious. Same thing with bluff catching. You have really wide ranges, so you're dealt really weak hands quite often, more often than you're used to. And to meet minimum defense thresholds, as you might understand from just general poker theory, you need to defend a percentage of that range. It's not like you can just continue to call, second pair or better, and that's going to cut it. You need to recognize where the top half or the top 2/3, the top 33% of your range is against different bet sizing. And it's hard to do that because your range is so wide. So it's just easy to end up folding too much. So bluff catching enough is hard. Overfolding is easy. And then the last thing, value betting thin enough, I said, is rare. This is more meant as encouragement to how good it can be to bluff catch light in a heads-up environment, because for how easy it is to bluff, for how easy it is to get dealt a hand that's like, jack high or weaker and think that you need to bluff it, it's even harder to layer on top of that aggression, finding value bets with fourth pair when your opponent's capped at ace high, or finding value bets with third pair out of position when your opponent could absolutely have better than third pair. These are uncomfortable things to do when we're not used to the ranges, so people's natural instinct is leaning them towards an over-bluffing strategy and a missing value strategy. So all of the above tends to be true. I'll take a step back for a second and just talk about why I think you should learn heads up, or at least spend some amount of time working on your heads up game. Number one is just the money. If you're a tournament professional or just a serious tournament player, when you get to heads up, the pay jump represents, 10% of the prize pool in a lot of cases, sometimes more if it's very top heavy. If you aren't taking a chop, which, if you've heard me speak on this topic before, I think that learning heads up is a pathway towards not needing to chop as often and having more leverage in chop negotiations. But that's kind of aside from the fact that you'll just sometimes have to play for whatever reason. It's the World Series and they won't let you chop, or you're playing online and your opponent doesn't click the box or whatever, and you just have to play it out. It's the biggest pay jump of the tournament, so when you're there, it matters a lot. Obviously, it doesn't come up that often, but that depends. If I was to jump ahead to number 3 here, small fields, if you play in a small player pool, if you're playing, 50-player tournaments on WPT Global, if you're playing 100-player tournaments at 10 a.m. on Winamax, you just get to heads up a lot. It's actually not that uncommon. If you play in small player pools or small field tournaments, And same idea, if you aspire to play high roller events, that's just what the environment is. They're small tournaments where you end up playing heads up quite often. So you just need to be good at the format. And then the last thing, which I wrote second, is just improving your skill in wide range scenarios. I think that if you look at a lot of former heads up players or one-time heads up specialists who moved their way into tournaments or other formats, they're just really good at like blind versus blind. They're really good at playing out of the big blind with 70% of hands against the button. These are high impact nodes, and you get more comfortable with the concepts of playing a really, really wide range if you practice heads up. So a little bit about the course that I produced, which I'll share the link at the end of this session. The format of this course is with the understanding that, tournament players don't have years or months to devote to heads up play only because there's so much other stuff that you could work on in heads up, right? In tournament format. So why would you think about heads up, day in and day out for months when you have ICM to learn and you have, PKOs to study? And I get that. So, the idea is that it's very, very simplified. Break it down into 4 stack depth categories, and we're going to go through each of these 4 today. I'll explain as we go through why I think these are uniquely important, but basically these are, if you just learn one pretty good strategy for playing short, one pretty good strategy for playing mid stack, one deep stack, one mega stack, you'll be fine. And honestly, if you only do the first 3, you'll also be fine. And the same thing applies to post-flop scenarios. So there's 4 primary ways that you will go post-flop. The pre-flop action is limp from the button, check in the big blind, and this happens most often at short stacks. The next option is you limp on the button, the big blind raises, and you call the raise, so a limp call pot. This happens most often at mid stack depth. Single raise pots, so the button open raises, and the big blind calls, and this happens more often at deep stacks, and 3-bet pots. So, the button raises, the big blind 3-bets, and you call. This happens most often at mega stack depth, 60 big blinds or higher. So this, once again, is just meant to kind of narrow your focus, narrow the scope of what it means to learn heads up and to become competent in the format. So we're going to go through 4 examples, focused as if the only thing you need to learn about, short stack play post-flop is how to play in limp check. That's obviously not true, but it's a pretty good way to get started, and it's a pretty good way to catch 80% of the value with 20% of the effort. Same idea for limp call, single raise pot, and 3-bet pot. So let's jump into some of those examples. So what you should see right now is my GTA Wizard tab, which it looks like you do now that I'm looking at the preview. And before I get into post-flop examples, I want to talk about how I interpret the way we play post-flop based on the pre-flop ranges. So hopefully this, my main goal for you by the end of this session is to understand the shape of preflop ranges, the different shapes that preflop ranges take, or the different hand classes that are emphasized, and as a result, how we end up playing postflop on different boards. If you can start to conceptualize that, then I think you get way better at wide range scenarios. You get way better at a variety of preflop spots. And if you have seen me do seminars or worked with me in the past, my coaching is very intentionally mechanics based, very intentionally non-specific in becoming an expert at one individual node. I want you to understand why things work the way they work so that you can apply that broadly. So in this example, this is our 10 big blind preflop ranges. I've set this up with, you can see over here that there's a little bit of extra in the pot. We don't go to 3 decimal places. So when I enter 1/8 of a big blind ante, it ends up being 0.13. So that's why it's 1.76 if anyone is very, very particular about their numerical calculations. But point being, we're playing online ante format. We're 10 big blinds effective. Here's the buttons strategy. So the limp check post-flop scenario starts with, of course, the limping range. And the limping range for the button is polar. I would describe it as polar. A lot of this comes up a lot at short stacks. You limp the top of your range with the intention of trapping and calling a shove. You limp the bottom of your range with the intention of seeing flops for cheap and folding if you face aggression. It's not going to work perfectly like that because the big blind could do other things like raise small, but just so that you understand what I'm talking about, if they were to jam and you have to decide, if it wasn't clear because the range is really, really wide at 10 big blinds, all of those hands up at the top right were traps planning to call, and all the hands on the bottom left or the bottom right were weak limps planning to fold. Everything in the middle, open shoves. Everything in the middle is open jamming to realize equity. This solution has been restricted to my own preferences. There's, of course, other ways you could play the spot, but I don't use any min raises at this stack depth. So we have a polar range on the button. Now the big blind is going to respond with checks. What does their checking range look like? Well, their checking range seems to be, you could call it linear. You could also call it capped, right? So the checking range is just medium strength suited hands, medium strength offsuit hands, and some of the trash that didn't bluff raise. But generally speaking, we're concentrated around medium strength hands as the checking range in the big blind. So now that we understand that, it should be easier to map towards post-flop play. Once again, just, if at any point I'm moving too quickly, just let me know in the chat. So I use this as a chance. I haven't actually looked at these yet, but I use this as a chance to run some custom reports with my newfound tokens in GTA Wizard. I think this is a pretty good use of custom reports. I won't get into all the details, but for my course, I built a bunch of custom solutions and custom drills in GTA Wizard. So those have particular bet sizing. Those are not the default heads up solutions that you would find in the library. So everything you're seeing today is my custom library. And as a result, if I wanted to talk to you about, what textures make sense to lead from the big blind in limp check, then, you need to be using the pre-flop ranges that I used for any of that to make sense. So these are custom reports using my sizings and my pre-flop ranges. And this is my first time looking at them, but I'm also expecting the results to be very similar to what I've already discovered from other reports. So a really quick, piece of advice on leading flops. If you're relatively new to heads up and you're not sure where to lead flops, then just don't. You don't need to lead flops. It's barely profitable anywhere. It doesn't really matter. I will, however, point out, because we're at 10 big blinds, and this is one of the best spots to lead flops, is that if I sort this report by checking frequency, and I look at the lowest check frequency boards, I'm going to see a lot of connected low to medium boards, right? Not a high card in sight, no cards higher than 9, maybe 10. All of these boards are connected and low, and also not monotone. I'm not sure that really matters to a great degree, but I'm just noticing that. But that should make sense based on what we saw from the pre-flop range, right? Linear, condensed around medium cards, low cards, and the button open folds some hands. So of course since they open fold, they don't hit all of the lowest cards. Other than that, you don't need to worry about leading. Let's talk about betting in position. So once again, in limp check, if you want to cut straight to the chase, I would say don't bother betting big. Bet one big blind as your sizing for whatever spots. And basically the information that I like to focus on is on which boards does my pre-flop range want to continue in a polar fashion, or on which boards does my pre-flop range want to continue in a linear fashion. So as I described pre-flop, polar limping range on the button. That means there's going to be certain boards where we don't hit the flop that well, and we probably want to proceed with a polar structure. You wouldn't stab, and I can just kind of flip here so you can see the types of boards I'm talking about. You are generally at a disadvantage on the small blind around medium cards, right? So queen through 9 high boards or queen through 8 high boards. That includes paired boards. It's a quirk of heads up that I maybe don't have too much time to get into, but just again, you can kind of see very quickly that the highest amount of checking is happening on the boards where we are polarized around those cards with our pre-flop range, and therefore we don't have a linear advantage. Another way to look at this would be to sort the report by out of position equity, and it maybe won't surprise you that on the highest out of position equity boards, we're doing, a significant amount of checking across all these boards, vice versa on the highest equity for in position boards, doing a lot of betting. So this should feel, I think, relatively basic. I want to show at least one example of a not so intuitive spot, perhaps. I think it will be intuitive, on ace queen 5 to just bet your whole range. So let's talk instead about a spot where maybe you would want to build more of a checking range. I have a category of flops that I call queen high and lower wet, and that's basically going to be this type of board. So let's pop that open. One little quirk of the report is that both sizes are being offered. It's my recommendation that you only use one bet size per board. So this would be the only scenario where I think it's reasonable to use a geometric sizing. This pot size is the same as 2E. If I write in 2E here, you're going to see that that's the same bet sizing. And I do think it makes sense for all the reasons that we just spoke about. Now, building a polarized post-flop range with a polarized pre-flop range is going to lead to, well, first of all, easier decisions, because a lot of the hands that are marginal on this board they're not here. They're grayed out, they're blacked out, right? Like an ace high, an unpaired ace high, for example, is a marginal hand on this flop. We don't have a lot of ace high because we open jam them pre-flop. So it makes sense to focus on the top and the bottom of the range when you think that your opponent connects well with this board. So this is an example of what that might look like. You know, the way that I analyze strategies really quickly is just to look at basically the value threshold, right? So the weakest value hand that I want to bet this size, it looks like a bad top pair is around the threshold. Also an under pair that would like protection and is good enough to stack off could also bet. But these hands are not making money by betting, right? Their EV is basically the same. But a hand like Queen 7, Queen 9, these hands are making money by betting. So that's the true value threshold. The hands that are earning money by betting. So build a polarized strategy around those hands and bluffs. And the same thing on the low end. What's the weakest hand, rather the strongest hand that we could bluff with? The strongest hand that makes sense to bluff. On that end, it looks like, Jack high gut shots are marginal, not necessarily doing well, but we're seeing a significant amount of bluffing from weaker than Jack 10, or weaker than Jack 9, I should say. So Jack 7 and lower. And we're not seeing a significant amount of bluffing from any king high hands or ace high hands. So as long as we bet some amount of hands Jack high and lower, and all of the hands effectively top pair and better, we've got a pretty good strategy. And that's as much attention as I would want to put into building a heads-up strategy as a non-heads-up specialist. Okay, let's jump over to the next example. So I'm going to go back to our reports, and I'm going to switch us to, actually I'm going to start with the solution. So I'm going to switch us to 17.5 big blind, limp call. So 17.5 big blinds is the bottom end of what I'm calling medium stack depth. It goes up to about 25 big blinds. And you can see that, at 17 big blinds, we're still open limping the button a lot. It's still relatively, there is a polar strategy happening here, and it is not the limping range. So this is the opposite of polar for the limping range. It's linear. The polar range that's being built here is min raising really good hands at the top, and min raising kind of like semi bluffs in tier 3. That's a separate conversation for those of you who are so inclined. But the limping range, as a result, is pretty linear. A lot of hands choose to limp. Almost everything mixes limp at some point, at some frequency. The raising range from the big blind is the polar range. Clearly polar, top range raising, and then some scattered bluffs throughout the offsuit region bluffing. So when we limp call, we continue to be linear. I would also go so far as to say that we are linear and uncapped, because you might notice that at mid stack depth, and this is true at shallow stack depth as well, we limp a lot of traps, namely like good pocket pairs, and those traps continue to trap against the raise. We're so shallow here, this is kind of like facing a 4-bet, or, for deep stack players, we don't want to put the last bet in with the nuts. So we don't have like ace high, we lack ace high as the small blind, so the big blind's going to have an ace high advantage, but we definitely have traps, and we have good hands. And otherwise just overall pretty good coverage of the middle of the deck. So what does that mean? We're basically flipping the positions here on what we just analyzed in the last spot, right? So the out of position player is polar. They have the top of the range and a bunch of the bottom. The in position player is linear. They have the middle of the deck very well covered. So, I think it should be intuitive. You can kind of understand that the favorability of different board types is going to flip here, right? So maybe just, quick way to make sure the chat's awake. Go ahead and before I open the report, go ahead and throw some suggestions, board textures in that you think the big blind will range bet. So the big blind raises pre, we call, in position. What do you think the big blind's going to range bet? What are some boards where you're expecting high frequency aggression? And then I will go through, once we get some guesses in, I'll go through an example of a polar strategy, because I think, the polar strategies are more unintuitive. So ace high boards, king 9x Broadway heavy, king 9x Broadway heavy, yeah. Ace high is a good guess. I'm going to start loading our report here in a moment. Broadway, yeah, a6x and Broadway. So we're going limp, right is call, loading our report here. So I'll show the range bets in a second. One thing I think is being underrated a little bit by the guesses is how good low cards are for the big blind. So if you remember, like the polar raising range has a bunch of trash and a bunch of really good cards. So that means that on the button, like you open fold some hands, then you limp, you face a raise, and then you call again. That calling range has a real lack of low cards. It's very middle card dense, right? And especially if you have an offsuit hand in the small blind, you do not have a deuce in your hand. You do not have a 3 or a 4 in your hand, right? It's very rare. So one advantage I think that big blind underrates when they're in these spots, these shallow, like pre-flop bluffing spots, and this is true blind versus blind as well, is like you have all the trashy offsuit low cards in your range, right? And when you flop a pair and heads up, you have a good hand. That's the other piece of this that you need to recognize is like if you've got 8 deuce offsuit on jack 4 deuce, like you're probably going to get stacks in at some point, or at least you're going to show down and win the pot. And if you have 9-3 off on 7-3 deuce, you have a monster, right? So relatively speaking. So these are important hand classes. So it's not surprising to me that not only are we seeing a lot of ace high boards in the range betting, but we're seeing double low card boards or triple low card boards, right? Boards that are paired to like the deuce 3, 4, 5, 6, boards that have a single high card and 2 low cards. These are very, very, very good for a polar pre-flop range. So yeah, that's the way to think about pre-flop to post-flop interaction is you've got a huge chunk of hands that will make second pair or third pair on these textures. Well, how good is second pair or third pair and heads up? Well, with an SPR of 2, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good hand. So with that out of the way, I'll talk about, playing out of position. I think one of the more difficult scenarios, one of the more difficult strategies, I guess, let's say that I recommend in my course is playing a polar strategy on Broadway boards. So let's talk about how that might look. I'm not going to show like every sizing recommendation that I make in every spot, but in these situations with the polar pre-flop range and the shallow stack depth, I do really like playing a 2-street geometric strategy on a lot of Broadway boards and ace high boards and everything of that nature. So I'm going to use ace jack 9 as an example. Where did that just go? There we go. I'm going to use ace jack 9 as an example because it should be pretty clean in seeing where the value thresholds are. And once again, that's, to me, just like the easiest way to understand what it is you're doing with your strategy. So single size dynamic. In this case, it's also, I must have just used a different solution. Anyway, sorry, I'm talking about my own stuff. So here it's already set to dynamic sizing. It's a polarized strategy. And here the stack to pot ratio is so low. And also we talked about before, the limp calling range is lacking so much ace. There's basically no aces, just a few suited aces here in the limp calling range and ace 5 offsuit. If you're the big blind at this stack to pot ratio and you've got pocket queens or king jack or queen jack, you've got a pretty strong hand and you are trying to put stacks in for value. Jack 10 suited as well. So given that the value threshold, I might say is around a medium jack, right? Like jack 10, jack 8, these hands seem to be making money by betting. Jack 4 is not really making money by betting. So that's your value threshold for this board. And your bluffing threshold, there's certainly some king high hands that are bluffing, but it looks kind of just like a mix all across the board. And I'm also not convinced that some of these stronger king highs are even bluffs. Like these hands are probably bet calling if they happen to face a jam because they have gut shots. But you're seeing a clear, high frequency amount of bluffing happening down here at like queen X, 10X, whatever other trash. So really any high card, but because I'm seeing such a strong preference for checking like these king highs here, I'm thinking that those are showdown value. So I would call, and even queen 8 has a gut shot. So I would call like bad queen high kind of the bluffing threshold. As long as you have less than queen 8, you should be bluffing at some point. And this is a good way. I do this a few times, even if you're not really facing shoves. When you're looking at polarized strategies, it is kind of a good idea. Emil just asked if I could show the response to the shove. It's a good way to figure out what the value threshold actually was. And you can see like queens is making a ton of money by calling, Jack 10 suited is making a ton of money, but pocket tens is not really making money. So that hand was like a weird mix in the first place. Same with king 8. Like king 8 is not really winning or losing versus shove. So like this hand was obviously not that great of a bluff in the first place if it's indifferent once you face a shove. But king queen very clearly putting the money in and making a good deal of money by doing so. So I think, good question there, just to kind of clarify where the line is for a value threshold. Here we're just, this is a 60% pot jam, right? On the flop, we're getting a super good price. If you just happen to have like a high card and a gut shot, it's just too much equity. But these are relatively rare spots, I would say. And it's a good time to just sort of mention, like, the difficulty here is for the imposition player to get a board like this, to face a big bet and actually to call enough. I think, like, to recognize that bottom pair is worth a lot of money, that any gut shot should be continuing, and that some king high backdoor flush draws are good enough to continue. Pocket fives is good enough to continue. This is definitely a challenging spot to defend enough when you increase size. So that would make me, having seen that very briefly, that would make me inclined to attack this board with a lot of my trashy bluffs. I see this texture, I recognize how capped they are. Increase size and basically just pure bluff all this stuff down here that's indifferent. Seems like a good spot to take. Okay, let's talk about the third spot, which is single raised pots. So I generally don't spend a lot of time on single raised pots below 25 big blinds. This is actually still part of mid-stack category, but you guys aren't using the course. You don't mind if I stretch the definitions a little bit, but I just happen to have a 25 big blind solution at the ready. And this is kind of, looking again at the pre-flop ranges, this is kind of the point where a significant amount of open raising starts to happen. We're up to 32% open raise from the button. There's a lot of limping still. And it's very similar to what we just looked at for 17.5. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, but just recognizing that more hands are open raising at this stack depth. So that's why it becomes important to study single raise pots at this point. So then for the big blind, we're just defending here. Not much to say about the big blind defense range. It's capped. You would 3-bet any good hand. It's linear. It's relatively wide. Yeah, just going to be plenty of board coverage for the big blind. So this will be a typical heads up spot. And then as I load us up here in heads up play, just to reiterate my first point, I don't lead the big blind in single raise pots. I think it's not worth the effort. There's very rarely a range advantage for the big blind. And that's just a thing to understand about heads up play in a lot of spots, is you rarely have a large advantage on any particular board unless you're shallow and it's like an ace high board where they don't have the ace. But as you get deeper, now we're getting into that depth where you just don't really have a big advantage on any board. So if I look at my, cheat sheet off to the side here for flop strategies in single raise pots, the linear spots, like the high frequency small betting spots, probably wouldn't surprise you. And I'll just sort by that for a second. It's a lot of ace and king high boards. It's a lot of paired boards. It's a lot of like dry, disconnected textures, right? Any spot where the big blind has a lot of trash. This is still the case in heads up. You're still doing a lot of small range betting in single raise pots. And it's perhaps worth mentioning, like this is related to the fact that pre-flop range is starting to get wider and is starting to get more linear, right? So the pre-flop range on the button is the first one we've looked at where it's like wide and linear and you're the aggressor. So as a result of that, we're now more comfortable going towards what you're probably used to from most spots, which is a linear opening range that connects well with a bunch of boards and a very loose big blind defending range that misses a lot of boards, right? So that's what's happening here. So this is going to feel more, probably the most familiar. This post-flop scenario is going to feel the most familiar. Where do I use a slightly strange strategy? I mean, I use polarized sizing, big sizing on Broadway boards, and I use it on some dynamic textures, but we've already looked at both of those. So I'll show the one thing we haven't looked at yet, which is kind of like a middle-ish connected type board where large sizing is appropriate. And so if I sort by the large sizing, it probably shouldn't take me long to find something like, I'd rather look at like a 10 high board. Let's look at this one. So something like Jack 8-7. Okay. So here, the other bet size is still in there. I can just remove it because it's barely being used. So we've got, in this case, 3 street geometric sizing. And, I've already shown you the method. I should have done a quiz for what the value threshold would be. That would have been a good one, but it's already here on screen. So imagine I did that. Imagine I was doing a better job at teaching this lesson and I remembered to quiz you on the value threshold. We're starting to get deeper. So the thing to notice is like as I increase the stack depth, I'm increasing the stack to pot ratio. We're now playing a stack to pot ratio of 5, which is still relatively low, but it's the largest we've seen. So we're starting to see more checks with like good hands. And if I just kind of hover or highlight all the best hand classes here, Jack 6 and lower is basically always checking. So we've got, top pair on a connected board. This is just not that strong in the context of this spot. It is I always like to do a little reference. It's a 70% equity hand, which is notably different from the hands that are pure betting, which looks to be, 75 to 80% equity type hand. So they're just not that good on Jack 8-7. The big blind has all the stuff, all the good things that you can have on this board. The big blind has it. So we're even checking behind some strong hands to balance on these types of boards. And this is stuff that I think generally doesn't get done in heads up play by less experienced players, which means that checking ranges in practice are way more capped than they should be. There's a big section of the course where I go through this as an exploitative idea, but basically you're not going to see most tournament players getting a Jack 8-7 two-tone board and starting to check behind two pair, checking behind a set, checking behind aces, right? This is uncommon. So the betting range in general, I think, is too strong on these boards, and it's a good idea because of how fast this board can change and how easy it is for the big blind to have all the good stuff when it does change. It's a good idea to protect your checking range, and it's a good idea to just jump on your opponents when they check. Yeah, I don't want to get in. I don't think we'll have time today, unfortunately, to do like turn strategy in any real depth, but maybe a coaching for the future where we could look at some of the particulars that come up on later streets. But certainly facing check back, I think, overbet turn, jam river with a thinner set of hands for value would be very effective. Doing it with a lot of bluffs would be very effective, more effective than it is in theory. As for bluffing, these are the types of boards where thresholds are less important than interaction of some kind. So if I look at no made hand, there's some, but not a ton of total trash bluffing. There's a little bit of 5 backdoor straight draw with a heart kind of thing, I suppose. There's actually a decent amount of nothing bluffing. I take that back. But, for larger bets across multiple streets in general, you're going to see a preference for more interaction with the board, some more 10x and 9x. You're seeing some overcard with backdoor type hands doing a lot of the bluffing. But you even see all the way up to ace and king high, right? Because the texture is a little bit funky, you're seeing more distribution across different hands that are bluffing. So I can't necessarily say, ace 9 is too good to bet on the flop, you have to show it down. It's not really operating that way, and I think that's because the board can change so quickly. So the strength of a king 3 or an ace king or a 3-2 suited, the strength of these hands can change rapidly as well. So this question about why is Jack 7 checking so much, it's basically just, there's a few ways I could describe this, but basically in a spot where your hand is marginal to stack off and you're not accomplishing, let's look at the response really quickly. We're not necessarily just getting it in all that often, right? The response is 0 jams, a bunch of calls, a bunch of a small-ish amount of raising. But what Jack 7 would love to do is just to open jam the flop and be called by worse, right? Your hand is good but vulnerable. Your hand can get worse really fast. So you're just in that category of, hands that are pretty good, but not the nuts, and they're not going to stay the nuts. And you generate some EV by slow playing with these hands. On clean cards, you make a lot more money. On bad cards, you lose less money, right? So it's just same as aces, same as Jack 4, Queen Jack, whatever. These are just hands that are, almost there in terms of wanting to just put a bunch of money in on every run out, but they also block calls and maybe benefit by checking behind. And that's a broad description, but it doesn't really address why pocket jacks and pocket eights are checking with more equity, but basically just recognize that we're already checking a lot of marginal hands on this board, so we're expecting EV in the future. We're expecting EV after we check. Okay, I'm going to breeze through 3-bet pots because I also think it's not that important of a spot for you to learn. 3-bet pots happen very deep. Deep stack play is not common in tournaments, so it is unimportant that you spend significant time learning rare spots when you are not planning to be an expert in this area. That said, 40 big blinds plus is kind of where I start to look at 3-bet pots in heads up. You can see at 40 big blinds, there's now a majority raising on the button. Almost every hand that's playing is raising at some frequency. You face a 3-bet, it's going to be polar at this stack depth. Polar is a little different in 3-bets because you're not obligated to play, these hands. When you raise against a limp and you're polar, you're raising hands that are down here. When you're raising against a raise and you're polar, you're choosing from like the fringy defense, right? You're choosing from hands that are kind of at the bottom of your pre-flop defending range. And, there's some mixing happening as well that I don't think is that important to replicate. But basically just describing it as polar, but recognizing that doesn't mean the big blind's going to have a bunch of like offsuit deuces in the range, right? They're polar, but they don't have the very bottom of the deck. And then when you call, it should be very reminiscent of like limp calling at 17.5. I've compared these two ranges a few times. In my course, you're quite likely to have the traps in your calling range versus 3-bet, as well as your limp calling range when short. But otherwise, it's very linear, very middle card heavy. So if we look at the report for this, you're going to see more aggression in general in 3-bet pots, just because, you have all the strong hands and the stack to pot ratio is quite low. But thinking of it basically like a limp call situation, I think you can anticipate like where I'm going to recommend polarized strategy and where I'm going to recommend linear strategy. The linear spots that I'm, reasonably on board with that come out of this report is pretty much any paired board. It doesn't really matter the rank in this spot, just any paired board, any dry texture. And the cool opportunity, I think, is, and it doesn't show up automatically in the reports, but I do think that on ace and king high boards, there's an opportunity to play more of a polarized strategy. And it's like the one weird recommendation that I made in 3-bet pots as well as in limp call pots, where I think that like even on dry ace high, it can be pretty successful to play a polarized strategy. And that really just goes back to the idea that, if I just look at the pre-flop range briefly, goes back to the idea that like the in position player, first of all, probably doesn't have this many aces in their calling range against you. They probably play tighter than this against 3-bet. But as the 3-better in heads up, you're supposed to have pocket pairs, queens all the way through 5s, basically pure in your 3-betting range. And if any of you play 6-max cash, this might be a familiar dynamic where like when you have all the pocket pairs in your pre-flop range, that's a lot of combos. They're more common than suited hands. So you could imagine that on like an ace high board, this range has the nuts reasonably often. It has an ace reasonably often, but then it has like under pairs next most often. And furthermore, on a king high board where you don't even have that much top pair, on a king high board, you have like a ton of ace high and then a ton of under pairs. So your range is kind of wacky on ace and king high boards. So I actually find it easier to play a polar strategy if I'm committed to this pre-flop range. So that's just one, bonus idea for taking this pre-flop range and like anticipating what's going to happen with different boards, recognizing like, I've got a lot of pocket pairs in my 3-bet range, a lot of suited hands, but not that much, it doesn't go that wide. It's not the bulk of the range. So maybe planning for what the pocket pairs would like to do, which is a lot of checking on the flop. You can build a strategy around a lot of checking on the flop. Okay, I am going to flip us back to the slides for a moment as I talk a little bit in summary and then also introduce you to my course briefly. So, the broad approach that I'm presenting here is that to get better at heads up play, you should focus on a few high value scenarios and find an edge in each of those scenarios. And I think that's going to go way further than trying to learn the game, A to Z in order. So I think the scenarios that I presented to you today are an idea, a jumping off point for how you could focus on just 3 or 4 spots, learn them pretty well, and figure out an exploit or figure out an edge that you're going to lean on in each of those 3 or 4 spots. In taking pre-flop ranges and turning them into post-flop decisions, hopefully, this showed a few different examples of how to focus on the bulk of the range. And I also like to do the same thing for exploiting my opponent's range. If you can focus on what they have quite often, you can figure out what's hard for that part of their range and do that thing. And I didn't talk about this yet. I'll maybe show quickly why I bring this up, but like you should play the trainer to get better at heads up. It is so quick to play spots in the trainer in heads up. You could play the exact same spot 100 times in a row in like 10 minutes. And you can learn individual nodes really quickly because the game is simple-ish, right? It's a simplified format. So I highly recommend playing the trainer as a way to get better. It's also very time efficient. for someone who's a non-expert in the game. And remember, as always in all these spots, I use this to guide my decision making in a ton of situations. If it's close, bluff catching, just lean and call. If it's close about bluffing, just bluff. Because remember, ranges are weaker than you think. They're weaker than your opponent thinks. You're just going to get into a ton of spots where those things I brought up at the beginning, how it's easy to bluff too much, it's easy to fold too much, it's hard to value bet then. That's just going to be true, sort of universally, in heads up. So before I show you this, well, I'll show you this. Why not? This is the course that I've been speaking about. If you are interested in this topic, then I hope that you will go further down this path. There's a ton of information in the course that details all the stuff that I've been kind of teasing here and getting into. I'm more than happy to answer questions specifically about this, either by DM on Instagram or Twitter, or sending me an email. You can find that on my website. But this is the direct website to the landing page, and I'm sharing this coupon code KRAB to get 20% off the price. So I did just want to I mentioned how important I thought training was. I just want to show you where I grabbed some of the solutions that we looked at today from. This is the drill library that's included in the course. All of these are hyperlinks to GTA Wizard solutions. They're all custom solutions that I built for the course. This is by far the most time-intensive part of the course, but I'm really happy with it. And so I have drills that cover, again, what I believe to just be like the most important spots. So pre-flop drills, but only a few stack debts. And one column here is one format. So if you're an online player, you only need to focus on column B. If you're a live player, you only need to focus on column C. If you're a heads up sit and go player, you only need to focus on column D. And having drills that focus on pre-flop, but also drills that focus on the individual nodes post-flop, like the ones I showed you today, I think are just really good for developing efficiently, developing just on the most important spots. And that's where I got the post-flop solutions that I was using today were pulled from here, which is why I was a little concerned about the bet sizing being wrong. But the key spots that I think are valuable for improving at different stack depths are linked here, and also inherently the bet sizing is the recommended bet sizing I've created for the course. So you can train and practice and study kind of all the same strategy. So that's one of the things you'll get if you do decide to go further in the course. Oh, and thanks, by the way, to GTA Wizard, if any of y'all are here or just watching this in general. Thanks for allowing me to share that. I feel lucky that I can, advertise something, at least briefly, on here. But, I am here just to do the coaching, first and foremost, and hopefully the session was useful. I want to thank everyone for tuning in live, for watching the recording, for whatever it is that you're doing. Thanks for hanging out. Hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.